The ultimatum arrived on a Tuesday morning at 0700, transmitted simultaneously on every registered diplomatic frequency, every open communications channel, and every emergency broadcast band that the Verk Dominion could reach. It was not a subtle message. The Verk did not do subtle. They did scale, and they did certainty, and they did the particular brand of overwhelming confidence that comes from 4 centuries of winning every conflict they had ever chosen to enter. The message was 14 seconds long. It was addressed to the leadership of the Terran Cooperative and every human-affiliated station, outpost, colony, and vessel within broadcast range. It said, in plain language with no diplomatic softening of any kind, that humanity had 48 hours to formally surrender all territorial claims, submit to Verk governance authority, and begin the process of integration into the Dominion as a dependent species. It said that failure to comply within the 48-hour window would result in the deployment of the Verk primary fleet, which was currently positioned at the edge of Terran space and had been for 11 days, waiting for exactly this moment. It said that the Verk Dominion had won every conflict in its 400-year history, and that humanity should consider this fact carefully before the window closed. Secretary General Adiz Akafer received the message in the middle of a briefing on agricultural export logistics that she had been attending for 40 minutes, and that had another 50 minutes remaining on the agenda. Her aide appeared at the door of the conference room, caught her eye, and held up a single finger. She excused herself without explanation, stepped into the corridor, read the message on the tablet her aide was holding, and stood quietly for approximately 12 seconds. Not 12 seconds of panic, not 12 seconds of fear, 12 seconds of the specific internal stillness that belongs to someone who has spent years preparing for a version of this exact moment and is now confirming that the preparation was correct and the moment has arrived. Then she handed the tablet back, returned to the conference room, and sat down at the table without changing her expression. She let the briefing run for another 7 minutes before she stopped it, because 7 minutes of agricultural logistics was not going to change what came next, and because the people in that room had come prepared to talk about grain transport, and it cost nothing to let them finish the point they were making. When she stopped the briefing, she told the people in the room what had happened. She told them plainly. She did not use soft language or frame it as a developing situation, or suggest that there was ambiguity about what the message meant. She said that the Verk Dominion had issued a formal ultimatum requiring Terran surrender within 48 hours, and that she would need the conference room for the foreseeable future, and that they should go about the rest of their day as normally as possible, and that she would be in contact with each of their departments before the end of the afternoon. Then she made 4 calls in order, beginning with Admiral Marcus Reyes at the Defense Cooperative and ending with Director Yara Mensa at the Earth Cartographic and Intelligence Office. The calls were brief. None of them required explanation, because all 4 people she called had been waiting for something like this for a long time, and they knew what the call meant, and they were already moving before she finished the sentence. She poured herself a cup of coffee from the carafe on the side table, sat back down at the head of the conference room table, opened her notebook to a fresh page, and began to work. The Defense Cooperative's senior command staff arrived within 20 minutes. Admiral Marcus Reyes came through the door first, which was consistent with every meeting he had ever attended in his career, because he was constitutionally incapable of arriving second to anything that mattered. His deputy commanders followed, then the heads of the 3 strategic analysis divisions, then Yara Mensa's senior intelligence officers, still pulling on their jackets, having transited from the intelligence building across the plaza at something between a fast walk and a controlled run. They arranged themselves around the table. They had all read the ultimatum. None of them needed it explained. Adiz looked at them and said, "Tell me what we actually have." What they actually had was not what the Verk expected them to have. This was, as Marcus Reyes would later note in the official after-action documentation, the central miscalculation of the entire incident. And it was a miscalculation of the most consequential kind, because it was not based on bad intelligence but on good intelligence that had been applied to the wrong question. The Werk had done their research thoroughly. They had conducted continuous survey Lancet operations in Terran space for approximately 3 years prior to issuing the ultimatum. They had mapped every human fleet position with care, cataloged vessel types and armament configurations, assessed manufacturing capacity at every known shipyard, and run computational projections based on every observable metric available to them. Their intelligence was accurate as far as it went. The problem was where it stopped going, and the reason it stopped where it did was that the most consequential things humanity had built over the previous decade were not the things that were visible from outside. The Werk had been watching the ships. They had not been watching the infrastructure that was making ships in places no one was watching. 8 years before the ultimatum, the Terran Cooperative had quietly begun the most significant construction project in human history. The project had no public name and appeared in no public budget document under any heading that would suggest its actual purpose. Internally, it was referred to as the Continuance Program, a designation chosen deliberately because it sounded administrative and developmental rather than strategic, because the people designing it understood that the moment it sounded strategic it would attract the kind of attention that strategic things attract, and that attention would defeat the entire purpose. The program's publicly stated rationale, in every document that referenced it at all, was the development of distributed manufacturing and resource processing capacity across the outer territories, intended to reduce supply chain vulnerability and support long-term colonial growth and self-sufficiency. That description was accurate. It was also in the way that accurate descriptions can sometimes be profoundly incomplete. What the Continuance Program had actually constructed, over 8 years of sustained effort funded through a budget distributed deliberately across 17 different departmental line items to prevent it from appearing as a single significant entry in any auditable document, was a network of 41 autonomous production facilities. They were embedded in asteroid fields, inside the rocky interiors of uninhabited moons, within the structural frames of deep space relay stations that appeared on external sensors as communications infrastructure and nothing more. Each facility was independently powered through systems that produced no detectable external signature. Each was staffed by small teams selected years in advance for their technical ability, their discretion, and their willingness to work in isolation for extended periods without acknowledgement or recognition. Each was capable of producing fully functional combat vessels at output rates that no single conventional shipyard could approach. None of the 41 facilities appeared on any public map or chart. Most did not appear on internal documents accessible outside the 6 individuals who had overseen the program from its inception. 2 of those 6 people were Admiral Marcus Reyes and Secretary General Adiz Akafer. They had been preparing for this specific kind of conversation for 4 years, though not for the Werk specifically, because the preparation was never about a specific adversary but about a specific category of event. The moment when an established power that had grown comfortable with its position encountered a younger civilization expanding faster than the established power had anticipated, and decided that the solution to its discomfort was a show of overwhelming force designed to end the question before it became a genuine contest. They had looked at 4 centuries of interspecies history and concluded with high confidence that humanity was going to have this conversation eventually. The only variables were the timing and the specific party on the other side of the table. When Adiz stood in the corridor for 12 seconds on Tuesday morning, part of what she was confirming was that the timing had arrived and that the preparation was ready. So when Reyes told the room what they actually had, he was not reading from a document he had prepared for this meeting. He was confirming, for the benefit of the people in the room who had not known, things that he and Adiz had known for years. He walked through it methodically. 41 production facilities, all operational, all currently running on standard scheduled output cycles. 217 combat-ready vessels already completed and distributed across holding positions throughout the outer territories, positions chosen specifically because they sat outside the coverage radius of every known external surveillance asset. Projected additional output across all 41 facilities over the following 48 hours, running at full authorized capacity. 89 more vessels. Total available fleet at the close of the ultimatum window, if they chose to use the full 48 hours before. Making any visible response, 306 ships. The Verk primary fleet, per the best available intelligence assessment, consisted of approximately 240 vessels of varying class and capability. Adiz Akafer wrote the number 306 in her notebook. She drew a small circle around it. The circle was not dramatic. It was the kind of mark someone makes when they are confirming that a number they expected to see is the number they are seeing, and that the number is sufficient. She looked up from the notebook and asked what the Verk's current position was telling them about their state of readiness and their expectations for the next 48 hours. Yara Mensa took over the briefing at that point. She had been running continuous signals analysis on the Verk fleet for 9 months, ever since the earliest intelligence indicators suggested that the Dominion was conducting an elevated level of surveillance on Terran space. She pulled up the display and walked the room through everything her team had assembled. The Verk fleet was holding a fixed position at the territorial boundary, approximately 14 hours at standard transit speed from the nearest significant human population center. Their internal communication patterns over the previous 11 days were exactly what you would see from a force that had positioned itself for a purpose. It expected to be completed without significant friction. The messages between the flagship and the subordinate vessels were routine, operationally sparse, and showed no evidence of contingency planning for scenarios other than the two they had assessed as most likely: Terran compliance within the window, or a defensive engagement by an undersized human fleet that their projections estimated could be resolved within 6 hours. There was one additional piece of information that Yara held until the end of the standard briefing, because it was the piece that changed the shape of everything else, and she wanted the room to have the foundational context before she introduced it. 3 days before the ultimatum was transmitted, the Verk Fleet's senior command had sent a detailed operational status report to the Dominion's Central Command Authority. It had been transmitted on an encrypted channel. It was the kind of channel that is built to be secure, and it was secure by the standards applied to it, except for the fact that the Terran Intelligence Service had been reading it for approximately 14 months. The report contained the fleet's position, fuel and ammunition status, crew readiness metrics by vessel class, and a full tactical briefing on the expected Terran response. The tactical briefing assessed human military capacity with reasonable accuracy based on all observable data. It projected that humanity would either comply within the window or attempt a defensive engagement with insufficient forces that would be concluded in the Dominion's favor within 6 hours of contact. The briefing did not mention the continuance program. It made no reference to 41 production facilities or 217 vessels already assembled in positions outside sensor range. It had not mentioned these things because the Verk surveillance had not found them, and the Verk surveillance had not found them because they had not been built in places where surveillance looks, and they had not been built in places where surveillance looks because the people who designed the program had understood 8 years earlier that this was the requirement. Adiz let the silence after Yara's briefing run for a moment. Then she asked for the current status of the 41 facilities. Reyes confirmed that all 41 were operational and running on standard scheduled output, awaiting authorization to increase to full production capacity. She said to authorize full production effective immediately. She said she wanted the 217 operational vessels to begin quiet movement toward pre-designated secondary assembly points, using the pre-plotted routes that avoided known surveillance coverage, and that she wanted the movement completed without any transmission that could be intercepted and decoded within 48 hours. She said she wanted someone to begin drafting the Terran Cooperative's formal response to the ultimatum. When someone asked what kind of response, she said a diplomatic one, thorough, citing precedent extensively, the kind of document that takes time to read and longer to work through. She said she wanted it transmitted at approximately the 36-hour mark of the 48-hour window. The room understood what 36 hours meant. It meant that whatever recalculation the Verk legal and diplomatic staff needed to do, they would be doing it in the 12 hours that remained on a clock they had set themselves. The 36 hours between that decision and the transmission of the diplomatic document were defined by two simultaneous realities that occupied completely different registers. On the surface, visible to anyone outside the room, almost nothing happened. The Terran Cooperative issued a brief acknowledgement of the ultimatum. It said that the message had been received and was under review by the appropriate authorities. It was phrased in the careful neutral language of an institution working through established procedure. It conveyed no alarm and no defiance and no indication of what was happening underneath it, which was correct, because what was happening underneath it was the point. The 41 facilities ran at maximum authorized capacity without pause. The teams working them were small by design and experienced by selection, chosen years earlier specifically for their capacity to work at high intensity in isolation, without the kind of communication that generates external signal. They worked through the hours in shifts, ate at their stations when the work required it, and maintained the operational silence that the program had required from its first day. The output accumulation across the network was steady and significant. Every few hours another vessel reached completion and began the transit to the assembly points, adding to the count that Reyes updated in the log without ceremony or announcement. The log entries were terse. They were the kind of entries that describe a process running as designed, which was what the process was doing. The 217 vessels that were already operational moved through space along routes that had been planned 3 years earlier by the Continuance Program's Logistics Division, routes that curved and adjusted specifically to avoid the detection patterns of any surveillance asset that Terran intelligence had identified as potentially active in the region. Some of the routes were considerably longer than direct transits would have been. The additional hours were accepted without complaint because the purpose of the routes was not speed but invisibility, and the invisibility was the entire operational point. The vessels arrived at the assembly points in sequence over roughly 18 hours, assembling in formations that had been rehearsed in simulation repeatedly, but had never been executed with actual ships in actual space until this moment. The formations held. The assembly points remained outside Verk's sensor range. The count climbed toward the number that Adiz had circled. At the 22-hour mark, a message arrived from Lieutenant Commander David Osai, who commanded CF-7, the production facility embedded in the asteroid field designation Outer Corridor 7. The message was 9 words: ahead of pace, no issues, continuing as planned. Reyes received it, logged it, and moved on. 9 words was exactly right. Every word in it was load-bearing, and there was no word in it that was not necessary, which made it a precise reflection of the man who had sent it, and of the work he had been doing for the previous 6 years, inside an asteroid that most of the galaxy did not know existed. At the 36-hour mark, the diplomatic response was transmitted to the Verk flagship. It was 47 pages in standard interspecies document formatting. It cited 63 precedents drawn from Galactic Boundary Commission rulings spanning 2 centuries of territorial dispute resolution across 14 recognized interspecies conflicts. It outlined the legal basis for every Terran territorial claim the Verk ultimatum had referenced, tracing each claim through the relevant survey history, settlement records, and commission filings that established its legitimacy under current convention. It noted, with specific citation of the relevant convention articles, that unilateral ultimatums issued without prior engagement of the established dispute resolution framework represented a significant and documented departure from accepted interspecies diplomatic practice, and that the Terran Cooperative reserved all applicable rights under those conventions pending completion of a full legal review. The document was written in the formal register of someone who intended to still be in this dispute in 5 years, and had organized 5 years' worth of documentation to sustain that position. It was also written at a level of density and technical precision that guaranteed the Verk legal staff would need several hours to work through it completely and arrive at a position on it. The Verk flagship acknowledged receipt at the 37-hour mark. The intelligence intercepts that followed showed a significant spike in internal message volume between the flagship and its embedded legal division, and between the flagship and Dominion Central Command. The tone had shifted. The messages from the earlier surveillance period had carried the quality of a command structure, managing a situation it had already resolved in its own analysis. The messages after the 37th hour had a different quality, the quality of a legal and strategic staff encountering a document that was more substantial than they had expected and working to determine what it changed about the situation they had assessed. At the 39-hour mark, Reyes reported to Adiz that the assembled fleet had reached 271 vessels and was continuing to grow as more production cleared the facilities and completed transit. The number was past anything the Verk intelligence assessment had projected as possible. It was past anything the Verk Fleet Command had been told to anticipate. It was sitting in space outside their sensor range, invisible, and it was continuing to grow. At the 41-hour mark, the Verk flagship transmitted a formal response to the diplomatic document. It was 4 pages. It rejected the procedural arguments regarding the dispute resolution framework. It reasserted the original terms of the ultimatum. It noted that the 48-hour window remained in effect and that the legal arguments presented, while noted in the record, did not alter the operational reality of the Dominion fleet's position or its authorization to act at the close of the window. The response was firm, and it was consistent with the position the Verk had taken from the beginning. It was also, in ways that only became visible when you compared it to the original 14-second ultimatum, measurably less certain. The original ultimatum had spoken from a position of absolute confidence. The 4-page response was working to maintain that confidence rather than simply expressing it, which is a different thing entirely, and the difference was visible to anyone who knew what they were reading. Adiz read the response. She noted its length and its tone. She noted that somewhere in 47 pages of Terran diplomatic history and legal precedent, something had introduced enough uncertainty into the Verk position that their response had needed to actively reassert confidence rather than simply assume it. She wrote the word noted in her notebook, single line, and asked Reyes for a current fleet count. 288 vessels, he said. 11 of the remaining production facilities had completed their projected 48-hour output. 3 were still running and should complete within 4 hours. He said that CF-14, which Osai's team was managing in addition to CF-7 during the final push, was tracking ahead of schedule and might come in above its projected number. She asked him to authorize the fleet to begin moving to a secondary assembly position at the 43-hour mark, and she asked him to choose a route for that movement that would cross the edge of the Verk sensor coverage area. She wanted them to see it. Reyes looked at her across the table for a moment. She explained, because it was worth explaining clearly. She wanted them to see a fleet moving in a direction, and at a scale they had not anticipated, at a time when they were already working through a legal document that had not been what they anticipated, With 7 hours left on a clock they had set themselves and could not easily walk back from without a reason. She wanted to give them the reason. She wanted to give them the mathematics of a situation that was not the situation they had assessed when they composed the ultimatum, and she wanted to give it to them with enough time remaining on their own clock that they could make a decision, while they still had the ability to make it cleanly. At the 43-hour mark, 288 Terran vessels began moving toward the secondary assembly position along a corridor that intersected the edge of the Verk sensor coverage. The movement was deliberate and unhurried. It was not arranged in an attack formation. It was arranged in the kind of formation that a very large number of ships uses when it is repositioning from one location to another, and is not particularly concerned about whether the repositioning is observed. The signal it sent was not aggression. The signal it sent was presence and quantity and the absence of anxiety about either. The Verk noticed within minutes. The intelligence intercepts from the 43-hour mark through the 46-hour mark represented the single highest volume of internal Verk command communication that the Terran service had ever captured in any comparable time window. The messages moved in rapid cycles between the Sensor Division, Tactical Command, the flagship's senior command staff, and Dominion Central Command. They were the messages of an institution that had received information that did not fit its working model and was cycling through the process of trying to reconcile the contradiction. The central question in the messages, as Yara Mensa's team assessed it after working through the volume, was not where these ships had come from. That question was present and would be answered. Later, in other rooms, in the extended internal review that follows every significant intelligence failure. The central operational question in those 3 hours, the question that the Verk command structure was actually trying to answer in real time, was what to do with 7 hours left on a clock they had issued publicly to a civilization that had turned out to have 300 ships they had not known about. At the 45-hour mark, the Verk flagship requested a direct communication channel with senior Terran cooperative leadership. Adiz accepted the request. She was at the same table she had occupied since Tuesday morning. She had slept approximately 4 hours somewhere in the middle of the previous night, in the chair in the corner of the conference room, fully clothed, and she had been back at the table before anyone else arrived in the morning. She had eaten every meal in that room. The coffee carafe had been refilled 8 times since Tuesday. She looked precisely like someone who had been working for 45 hours on something requiring complete and sustained focus, which she had. She also looked exactly like someone who knew how the next conversation was going to go, because she had spent 4 years thinking about how conversations like this one end. High Marshal Soth Varon appeared on the screen. He had commanded the Verk primary fleet for 16 years and had overseen 3 successful annexations and 2 complete capitulations. He was, by every measure available, an experienced and capable military commander. He looked at the 45th hour of a 48-hour ultimatum window, like a man who had spent several hours attempting to reconcile what his sensors were showing him with what his intelligence briefings had prepared him to expect, and who had arrived at the point where the reconciliation required a conversation. He said, "Secretary General." She said, "High Marshal." There was a pause that lasted long enough to be intentional on both sides and short enough to avoid becoming something else. He said that the vessels his sensors were detecting in the secondary assembly position numbered 288, and that his intelligence assessment of Terran military capacity had not included 288 vessels of those classifications. She said that it had not. He asked where they had come from. She considered the question for a moment, and then said that they had been built, over approximately 8 years, in facilities that the cooperative had not publicized because there had been no reason to publicize them. She said that humanity had not been building toward a confrontation but toward a future, and that those two things are sometimes, not always, the same project. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that 3 hours remained in the ultimatum window. She confirmed this. He said that the Werkdominion had issued the ultimatum based on an assessment of comparative military capacity that had not accounted for the vessels currently under observation. She said that appeared to be correct. His expression, across the transmission, was the expression of a professional operating in conditions that his professional experience had not fully prepared him for, which is a specific and recognizable expression, and which she had seen before in other rooms on other occasions, and which meant that the next words would be the ones that mattered. He said that he was going to recommend to Dominion Central Command that the current ultimatum be suspended pending a full review of the intelligence assessment on which it had been based. She said that seemed reasonable. He said that the Terran Cooperative would presumably be willing to engage in that review process through the established channels. She said that the Terran Cooperative had always been willing to engage through established channels and had said so consistently, and that this remained true. He said that the fleet would hold its current position pending further instruction from Central Command. She said that the Cooperative appreciated the communication. The channel closed at the 46-hour and 53-minute mark. The ultimatum window had 7 minutes remaining when the conversation ended. In those 7 minutes, no one in the conference room said anything of significance. Yara Mensa checked the intercept feeds and confirmed that the Werk flagship's internal communications had shifted to the specific pattern she associated with a command structure, executing a formal stand-down while simultaneously beginning the internal documentation process for an after-action review. Reyes confirmed that CF-14 had completed its output and that the fleet total had reached 311 vessels. Adiz wrote the number in her notebook. She drew the small circle around it. She closed the notebook. She told everyone in the room to go sleep. She said it without softening because they had all been awake for a very long time and the crisis was resolved, and what came next was diplomacy, which required clarity, and clarity required rest. She said she would see them in 6 hours. They left. She did not move from her chair for another 20 minutes. She sat and looked at the closed notebook and finished the cold coffee in the cup beside her, the coffee that had been poured at the 43rd hour and had long since gone the temperature of the room around it. She thought, in those 20 minutes, about the 8 years of work that had produced 41 facilities in places no one had looked. She thought about the people who had staffed those facilities, who had gone to work every day for years doing something that could not be acknowledged and would not be acknowledged until a crisis arrived to make acknowledgement possible, and who had done it anyway because they had understood that the work mattered and that mattering and being seen are different things, and the work does not require the second thing to be the first thing. She thought about the 9-word message from David Osai at the 22-hour mark. Ahead of pace, no issues, continuing as planned. She thought about what it meant to send 9 words when 9 words is what is true and everything else would be noise. She thought about a Tuesday morning and 12 seconds in a corridor and the specific quality of knowing what to do next because you have spent years preparing to know it. The Werkdominion issued a formal public statement 42 hours after the ultimatum window closed. The statement acknowledged that the original ultimatum had been issued based on an intelligence assessment that had not fully accounted for all relevant aspects of Terran military capacity, and that the Dominion was committed to resolving all outstanding territorial questions through the Galactic Boundary Commission's established framework. The statement was careful in its phrasing in a way that formal statements issued after significant miscalculations are always careful, walking the precise line between accountability and the maintenance of institutional dignity. It did not use the word mistake. It used the phrase revised assessment of the operational context, which conveyed the same meaning, and everyone who read it understood that it conveyed the same meaning, and no one said so out loud because that is also how these things work. The Galactic Boundary Commission convened a full territorial review 11 weeks after the incident. The Terran Cooperative sent a delegation that included Adiz Akafar and Yara Mensa, and a legal team that had spent the intervening weeks organizing 63 precedents into a coherent territorial argument that the Commission's chief reviewer later described, in private correspondence, as the most thoroughly prepared submission she had encountered in 23 years on the bench. The review process ran for 8 months. The Commission's ruling affirmed all existing Terran territorial claims, established a coordination framework for future expansion discussions with adjacent powers, and noted in its formal finding that the Terran Cooperative had demonstrated a consistent commitment to established diplomatic processes and interspecies legal convention throughout the review period. The 41 continuance program facilities were acknowledged in a brief official statement following the Commission ruling. It noted their existence, their operational history, and their role in the infrastructure development of the outer territories. There was no public ceremony. The Secretary General did not make a speech about it. The facilities kept operating because the work they did was useful and necessary independent of any particular crisis. And because the people who ran them had not shown up to be acknowledged, they had shown up because the work needed doing. Lieutenant Commander David Ose received a formal commendation for his work leading the CF-7 and CF-14 production teams through the 48-hour window. He read the commendation, filed it in the appropriate location in his records, and returned to the production schedule, which was running 3% below its monthly output target due to a maintenance cycle on 2 of the fabrication units, and he wanted to understand the cause before the end of the week. Yara Mensa's intelligence team received a collective commendation for 14 months of sustained surveillance work on an encrypted channel that the Verk had considered secure. The commendation noted that the intelligence collected through that work had provided the foundational information that shaped the cooperative's entire response strategy. Yara filed the commendation and went back to the 3 new surveillance operations her team had opened in the weeks following the incident, because the kind of attention that produces useful intelligence does not stop being useful just because the M88 crisis has resolved. Marcus Reyes updated the after-action documentation over the course of 4 months, working through every hour of the 48-hour window in detail, noting every decision and its rationale and its outcome. The documentation was classified at its highest level and would remain so for 20 years, at which point it would be released to academic institutions for study. He knew, when he was writing it, that the people who would read it 20 years later would be studying it for the lessons it contained, and he tried to write it in a way that made those lessons visible rather than burying them in the language of institutional formality. The central lesson, as he articulated it in the document's conclusion, was not about military capacity or production infrastructure or diplomatic strategy, though all of those things were present and all of them mattered. The central lesson was about the relationship between preparation and time. The Verk had given humanity 48 hours. Humanity had been preparing for 8 years. Those are not the same unit of measurement, and the 48 hours was always going to be insufficient against the 8 years, and the only question had been whether humanity would know that when the 48 hours arrived. They had known. They had known because 2 people had sat down 4 years before any ultimatum was issued and looked at the shape of things and decided to prepare, and because the people they had asked to do the preparing had done it completely and quietly, and over a very long time without recognition or ceremony or any external confirmation that the preparation would ever be needed. That is the hardest kind of work to do. It is the work that is done entirely on the basis of understanding why it matters, rather than on the basis of immediate feedback confirming that it matters. It requires a particular kind of commitment, the commitment of a person who can hold a long view clearly enough to act on it in the present, consistently, over years, in the absence of the urgency that makes such action feel obviously necessary. At the 47-hour and 18-minute mark, before the window had closed, before the conversation with High Marshal Varen had taken place, Yara Mensa had flagged a shift in the Werk internal communications pattern that she noted in the log with a single line. The math has completed. What she meant was that the Werk command structure had finished running the numbers and had arrived at a conclusion about what the numbers meant, and that the conclusion was not the conclusion they had expected to arrive at when they composed the ultimatum, and that what came after that conclusion was not a question of military capacity, but of institutional decision-making under conditions that had changed significantly from the conditions under which the original decision had been made. The math completing is not the end of a crisis. It is the beginning of the part of the crisis where the resolution becomes possible, because resolution requires that both sides be working from the same set of facts, and the math completing means the facts have arrived. In 47 hours and 18 minutes, before the clock they had set had finished running, it was already over. Not because of a battle, and not because of a threat, and not because of any single moment of confrontation or demonstration of force. It was over because of 8 years of quiet work in places no one was watching, and because of 9 words sent at the 22nd hour, by a man in an asteroid who understood that 9 words was exactly the right amount, and because of 12 seconds in a corridor on a Tuesday morning, when a woman confirmed for herself that the preparation had been done, and the moment had arrived, and she knew what to do next. The coffee is always cold by the time the work is done. You drink it anyway. The work was never about the coffee. The work was about the thing that happens when preparation meets its moment, and the moment was always coming, and the only question was whether the preparation would be there when it arrived. In 47 hours and 18 minutes it was there. It had been there for 8 years. That is the whole story. The rest is documentation. If you made it all the way here, comment 47 hours below. Share this with someone who is building something important that no one can see yet. The building is the thing. The recognition comes later or it does not come at all, and either way the building was worth doing. Do it right. Do it in time.